The morning frost had barely lifted off the fields when Eleanor Whitmore stepped out onto the wide porch of her estate, wrapped in a shawl the color of dried lavender, her silver-streaked hair pinned neatly beneath a wool bonnet. She was 61 years old, a widow of 11 years, and the wealthiest woman in the county, though she rarely thought of herself that way. To her, wealth had never been the mansion with its 12 rooms, nor the orchards that stretched toward the hills, nor the accounts that sat untouched in the bank in town. Wealth, to Eleanor, had once meant a husband who read to her by the fire, a daughter who laughed too loudly at her own jokes, and a house that was never quiet. All three had been taken from her, one after another, over the span of a decade, until the silence became so complete that even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like an accusation. She had learned to live inside that silence. She had built a life around routines, the tending of her small vegetable garden, the baking of bread twice a week, the long walks along the property line that separated her land from the town beyond. It was on one such morning, with the sun still low and orange over the frost-covered grass, that she noticed something was wrong with her kitchen window. The latch, which she always secured herself each night out of habit more than fear, was hanging loose, swinging gently in the breeze. Her first instinct was alarm. Her second was curiosity. She had lived long enough, and lost enough, that fear no longer moved as quickly through her as it once had. She stepped carefully around the side of the house, her boots crunching over the frost, and there, crouched beneath the kitchen window with his back pressed against the stone foundation, was a boy, no older than 8, she guessed, clutching 2 loaves of bread against his chest as though they were the only warmth left in the world. He froze when he saw her. His eyes, wide and dark, darted toward the fence line as if calculating whether he could run. But something in his posture told her he wouldn't. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was hunger deep enough to override fear. Eleanor did not shout. She did not call for her groundskeeper, who was surely somewhere near the stables by now. She simply stood there, hands folded in front of her, and studied the boy the way she might study a stray dog she wasn't sure yet whether to feed or shoo away. "That bread is still warm," she said finally, her voice quiet in the cold air. "I only pulled it from the oven an hour ago." The boy said nothing. His knuckles had gone white around the loaves. "Is there someone waiting for you? Or did you climb through my window all on your own, for the simple pleasure of my sourdough?" Still nothing. But his eyes flicked, just briefly, toward the tree line at the edge of her property, where a narrow dirt path led down toward the poorer end of town, the collection of small, weathered houses where the miners and the laborers and the widowed lived crowded together, doing what they could to survive a winter that had already claimed 2 lives from cold and hunger that season. "You have a father," Eleanor said. It was not a question. Something about the boy's clothes, mended at the elbows with mismatched thread, clearly stitched by unpracticed hands, a man's hands, told her enough. "And I suspect he does not know you are here." The boy's chin trembled, just slightly, and that was when Eleanor's resolve, which had been so carefully built over 11 years into something resembling stone, cracked just enough to let something warmer through. "Come inside," she said. "It's too cold to stand out here arguing about bread." She did not wait for his answer. She turned and walked toward the kitchen door, trusting that hunger or curiosity, or the simple relief of being offered warmth rather than punishment, would bring him along behind her. It did. He followed a few paces back, still clutching the loaves as if she might change her mind and demand them back, but he followed. Inside, she set a kettle on the stove and gestured for him to sit at the long wooden table where she took her meals alone each day. She did not ask his name yet. She sensed that trust, for a boy who had just been caught stealing, would need to be built slowly, like a wall laid one careful stone at a time. Instead, she busied herself slicing a wedge of cheese, pulling down a jar of preserves, setting out butter that had been churned that same week. She placed it all before him without ceremony, as though feeding hungry children who broke into her kitchen was simply part of her Tuesday. The boy ate like someone who had learned not to trust that food would still be there in 5 minutes. He did not speak until the plate was nearly empty, and even then, his words came out cautious, testing. You're not going to call the sheriff? Should I? My friend said if you get caught stealing, they take you to the jail. Even kids. Your friend sounds like he has spent a great deal of time worrying about things that have not yet happened, Eleanor said, pouring tea into a chipped cup and sliding it toward him. What is your name? Samuel, he said, after a pause long enough that she wondered if he'd give a false one. Some. And how many mouths are you feeding, Sam? That 2 loaves of my bread seemed worth the risk of prison. His face flushed, not with anger but with something closer to shame, and Eleanor immediately regretted the phrasing, though she did not take it back. Some truths needed to be spoken plainly if they were ever going to be addressed at all. Just me and my sister, he said. And Pa, but he doesn't eat much. He gives us his share most nights. And where is your mother? She died 2 winters back. Sickness took her. Eleanor nodded slowly, the kind of nod that came not from surprise but from recognition, the particular ache of a story she understood too well, though the details of her own losses were different. She did not offer sympathy, because she suspected the boy had received enough hollow condolences to last a lifetime, and what he needed now was not pity but practicality. And your father? Does he know you left the house this morning? Sam shook his head, staring down at the table. He'd be angry. He says we don't take charity. He says a man provides for his own, even if it means going without. Theft is not quite the same as charity, Eleanor said, though not unkindly. I know, Sam whispered. But charity means someone giving it to you feeling sorry for you. Stealing means you took it yourself. Pa doesn't have to know how it got there. There was a logic to this that Eleanor found herself unable to fully argue against, even as she recognized its flaws. She studied the boy a long moment, this small, proud creature who had inherited his father's stubbornness along with his hunger, and something in her chest, a place that had been closed for so long she'd nearly forgotten it existed, opened just a crack. Finish your tea, she said. And then you'll take me to meet your father. Not to turn you in. I only wish to speak with him. Sam's eyes went wide with alarm, and for a moment Eleanor feared he might bolt from the table entirely. Loaves be damned. He'll be so mad. Please, ma'am, don't. I am not asking you to trust me blindly, Eleanor said, gently but firmly, the tone she might once have used with her own daughter when a difficult truth needed saying. I am asking you to trust that a grown woman walking calmly to your father's door with 2 loaves of bread in her basket is unlikely to end in your imprisonment. Now finish your tea. The walk to the Miners' Row took the better part of an hour, down the frost-hardened path that wound past the orchard and through a stretch of scrubland before the houses came into view. Small, gray, huddled together as though for warmth they could not otherwise afford. Sam led her to the 3rd house from the end, its roof patched with mismatched shingles, smoke rising thin and reluctant from its chimney. The man who opened the door was younger than Eleanor had expected, though the lines around his eyes suggested a life that had aged him faster than his years. He wore a work shirt too thin for the season, his sleeves rolled despite the cold, his hands calloused and raw. A girl of perhaps 5 peered out from behind his legs, her hair in uneven braids that spoke of a father's earnest but untrained attempt at care. Sam, the man said, his eyes moving from his son to Eleanor and back again, confusion rapidly giving way to a wariness that bordered on fear. What's this about? Mr. Eleanor paused, realizing she did not yet know his name. Cole, he said. Thomas Cole. Mr. Cole. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. Your son paid a visit to my kitchen window this morning. She watched the color drain from his face, watched his jaw tighten, watched him turn toward Sam with an expression that was not quite anger but something more painful, the look of a man watching the walls he'd built around his family's dignity crumble in front of a stranger. Is this true? Sam's eyes dropped to the ground, and Eleanor stepped in before the boy could answer, before shame could do its damage. He is a resourceful child, she said, who was trying to feed his sister. I am not here to shame him, and I did not come to shame you either, Mr. Cole. I came because I have more bread than one woman can eat, more space in my house than one woman can fill, and a great deal more time on my hands than I know what to do with. I wondered if you might allow me to be useful." Thomas Cole's pride, Eleanor could see immediately, was not going to make this easy. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, and the words that came out were clipped, defensive. "We don't need charity, Mrs. Whitmore. I work. I provide." "I don't doubt that you work," Eleanor said evenly. "The mines don't pay men who don't work, and they certainly don't pay men who complain about the wage they're given. I'm not questioning your effort, Mr. Cole. I am observing that effort and outcome do not always align, particularly not in a winter as hard as this one, and particularly not for a man raising 2 children alone." The words landed harder than she intended, and she watched something flicker across his face. Not offense, but the particular pain of being seen too clearly by a stranger. He looked away, toward the hills, toward anything that wasn't her steady, knowing gaze. "I won't have my children think we take what we haven't earned," he said quietly. "Then let them earn it," Eleanor replied. "I have an orchard I can no longer tend alone. Fences that need mending before spring. A kitchen garden that has gone half to weeds because my knees no longer forgive me for kneeling in the dirt the way they once did. I am not offering you charity, Mr. Cole. I am offering you work, and I am asking that you bring your children with you, because a house as large and empty as mine has no business staying that quiet, and because a boy resourceful enough to pick a window latch deserves better use of his talents than burglary." For a long moment, Thomas Cole said nothing. The girl behind his legs peeked out further, studying Eleanor with a frank, unguarded curiosity that only small children seem to retain. Sam stood very still, watching his father's face for some sign of what was to come. "Bring your children too," Eleanor said again, softer this time, and something about the repetition, the plainness of it, the lack of pity in it, seemed to reach him in a way her earlier words had not. "I'll think on it," Thomas said finally, which Eleanor understood to be as close to acceptance as his pride would allow him to offer that day. She left the bread on the table before she departed, along with a small jar of preserves, and did not mention it again, did not wait to be thanked. She simply nodded to the little girl, whose name she learned as Clara, and made her way back up the frost-hardened path toward her own quiet house, uncertain whether she had done something foolish or something necessary, only certain that for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, the walk home did not feel quite so long. He came 3 days later. Eleanor was in the garden, inspecting the frost damage on what remained of her autumn vegetables, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path and turned to find Thomas Cole standing at the edge of her property, hat in hand, Sam and Clara trailing behind him with a particular caution of children unsure whether they were welcome. "You said something about fences," he said, by way of greeting, and Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen at the sight of him. Not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. "I did," she said. "Though I confess the fences were somewhat exaggerated in their urgency. Come in. I'll show you what needs doing, and the children can help me with the garden, if they're willing." What began as a single day's labor stretched into a week, and then a month, and Eleanor found herself rearranging the rhythms of her life around the sound of Thomas's hammer against fence posts, around Clara's small voice asking endless questions about which plants were weeds and which were vegetables, around Sam's careful, serious attention to every task given him, as though determined to prove that his family's presence on her land was earned and not given. She began teaching Clara her letters in the evenings, when Thomas came to collect the children after his work was done, spreading a slate across the kitchen table while the girl's tongue poked out in concentration. She caught herself, more than once, laughing at something Sam said. A genuine laugh, the kind she had not produced in years, the kind that startled her with its own unfamiliarity. She began cooking for 4 instead of 1, without quite deciding to, the extra portions simply becoming habit. Thomas remained guarded for longer than his children did, his pride a wall built brick by brick over 2 hard years of loss and labor, but even walls wear down under enough patient weather. Eleanor did not push. She simply continued being present, continued offering work rather than pity, continued treating his children with the same unhurried warmth she might have once given her own daughter, until one evening in late winter, as the four of them sat around her long table sharing a meal that had become, without anyone quite naming it as such, a nightly ritual. Thomas set down his fork and looked at her with something that had softened considerably since that first defensive stance on his doorstep. "I never thanked you properly," he said, "for not turning Sam over to the sheriff. For not treating us like something broken that needed fixing." "You were never broken," Eleanor said. "Only tired. There's a difference, though I understand why it doesn't always feel that way. Still, most folks with a house like this one wouldn't have opened the door to a boy caught stealing from their kitchen." "Most folks with a house like this one," Eleanor said, glancing around the table at the three faces that had, over the course of a single winter, filled rooms that had stood empty and silent for over a decade, "have forgotten what a house is actually for." Clara, who had been half listening while pushing peas around her plate, looked up suddenly. "Are we gonna keep coming here? Even when it's not cold anymore?" Eleanor found herself glancing at Thomas before answering, an unspoken question passing between the two adults who had, without either quite intending it, become something like partners in the raising of these two children, something like companions against the particular loneliness that had shaped both their lives before this winter brought them together. "I should think so," Eleanor said. "If your father is willing." Thomas held her gaze a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and something passed between them that neither named aloud. Not yet, though it lived in the room as clearly as the warmth from the stove. "I think," he said slowly, "we'd be willing." Spring came earlier than expected that year, the frost lifting off the fields weeks ahead of schedule, and by the time the orchard blossomed white and fragrant, the Cole family had all but moved into the rhythms of Eleanor's estate. Not as employees, not quite as charity cases either, but as something that had grown organically out of both, into a shape neither of them could have predicted the morning a hungry boy climbed through a kitchen window in search of bread. Sam grew taller and steadier, his careful seriousness softening into something closer to boyish ease as trust accumulated between him and the woman who had once caught him stealing. Clara learned her letters well enough to read simple stories aloud by the fire each evening, her small voice filling rooms that had once known only silence. And Eleanor, who had spent 11 years believing that wealth without family was simply another word for emptiness, found herself, on a warm evening in early June, standing on her porch watching Thomas teach Sam to mend a section of fence while Clara chased fireflies across the lawn in the fading light, and understood with a clarity that startled her that she was, for the first time since her husband's death, entirely, uncomplicatedly happy. It was not the bread that had changed everything, though the bread had been where it started. It was the choosing, her choice to open a door rather than call for the sheriff, Thomas's choice to swallow his pride and knock on a stranger's gate, the children's choice to trust an old woman who fed them without asking anything in return. Wealth, Eleanor had come to understand over that long winter, was never about what sat locked away in a bank vault or grew untouched in an orchard. It was about what filled a house, what filled a life, and for the first time in over a decade, hers was full again. Full of small footsteps on the stairs, full of a man's low laughter drifting in from the fields, full of a girl's questions and a boy's quiet, careful gratitude, full of everything she had once feared she would never have again. She had caught a hungry boy stealing bread on a frost-covered morning, and in return, without either of them quite realizing it at the time, he had given her back a family.